The candle on Duke Arthur's desk had burned down to a stub, and he did not notice. He was too tired to notice much of anything these days. His eyes moved slowly across the trade ledgers spread before him, the neat columns of figures blurring together like rain on a window pane. Silvercrest Manor was silent around him. The great house settled into the hush of a cold spring evening, and the only sound was the soft scratch of his own pen and the low crackle of the fire in the grate. He reached for the silver goblet at his elbow. Water. His throat had been dry all week, dry as old parchment, and he could not seem to drink enough of it. His fingers had just closed around the cool metal when the study door opened without a knock. Arthur looked up, ready to be sharp. It was only the maid, the quiet one, Sarah, who kept to the corners of rooms and never met his eye. She carried the water pitcher as she always did, her plain gray dress and white apron making her near invisible against the paneled walls. He nearly waved her out. Then he saw her hands were shaking. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps, set the pitcher down, and turned to the door behind her. He heard the heavy iron key turn in the lock. The bolt slid home with a sound like a small thunderclap. "What in heaven's name?" Arthur began, rising from his chair. Sarah spun to face him. She was between him and the desk now, close enough that he could see the fear on her pale face, and something else beneath it. Something steadier than fear. Her eyes dropped to the goblet still in his hand, and her whole body went rigid. "Don't move," she said. Her voice was a low whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. "And follow me." Arthur stared at her. He was a duke. Servants did not lock doors. Servants did not give commands. A cold anger rose in his chest, and he opened his mouth to summon the footman, to have this madwoman dragged from his sight. But she did not look away from him, and there was such weight in her gaze, such terrible, certain gravity, that the words died in his throat. In 12 years he had never once truly looked at this girl. Now he could not look away. Slowly, very slowly, he lowered the goblet back to the desk. The moment the silver touched the wood, Sarah let out a breath she had been holding. "Not that cup, Your Grace," she murmured. "Never that cup." "You will explain yourself," Arthur said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "At once. There is no time." She moved past him toward the far wall, where a great oil portrait of his late father hung in a gilded frame. Her fingers found the edge of it and pressed. "There is a man in this house tonight who means to see you dead before morning. And I would wager my life he is already climbing the east stairs." Arthur's laugh was thin and disbelieving. "Dead. In my own home. Girl, do you know what you are saying? I could have you turned out onto the road for such—" There was a sound. It came from the corridor beyond the locked door. A footstep, then another. The unhurried tread of a man who believed he had all the time in the world. Sarah froze, her hand still on the portrait. Her eyes met Arthur's, and in them he read a single silent question. "Do you believe me now?" The tread stopped outside the study. The door handle turned. Once, slowly, it caught against the lock and held. Arthur's heart, which had been beating so sluggishly these past days, began to hammer. He looked at the locked door. He looked at the shaking maid. He looked at the silver goblet gleaming innocently on his desk in the firelight, the water within it, still and clear. A knock came, soft, almost gentle. "Your Grace?" A voice from the other side, smooth, familiar, warm as an old friend's. Arthur knew that voice. He had known it half his life. "Your Grace, it is only me. I saw your candle burning. Might I come in? There is a matter I would speak of." Arthur's mouth went dry as dust. Sarah pressed harder against the frame. There was a soft click, and a section of the paneled wall swung inward on hidden hinges, releasing a breath of cold, stale air and the smell of dust and old stone. Beyond it lay a narrow passage, black as a well, the servants' maintenance corridor, that ran unseen through the bones of the great house. She held out her hand to him, not the gesture of a servant, the gesture of one drowning soul to another. "Please," she whispered, "if you drink from that cup, if you so much as open that door, you will not live to see the sun rise. I swear it on my father's grave." The knock came again, harder now. The handle rattled. "Your Grace? The door seems to be locked. That is strange. Let me fetch the key." The footsteps retreated. Quick now, purposeful, and in that instant, Arthur understood that he had perhaps 1 minute to choose, to stay and trust the smooth, familiar voice he had trusted for years, or to run into the darkness with a maid whose name he had barely known that morning. He looked once more at the goblet. He thought of the strange fatigue that had dogged him all week, the trembling in his hands he had blamed on poor sleep, the way his heart seemed to stumble in his chest like a tired horse. 4 days. It had started 4 days ago. Cold understanding poured through him like ice water. Arthur crossed the room. He did not take the maid's hand. A duke's pride ran too deep for that. But he stepped past her, into the dark passage, and that was answer enough. Sarah slipped in behind him and pulled the hidden panel shut, just as, on the other side of the study door, a key scraped into the lock. They stood together in the pitch black, breathing hard, and through the wall they heard the heavy door swing open. They heard slow footsteps enter the empty room. They heard a long, thoughtful silence. Then a voice, no longer warm at all, spoke to the empty study. "Now where?" it said softly. "Have you gone?" Sarah's hand found Arthur's sleeve in the dark and pulled. And the Duke of Silvercrest, master of all he surveyed, fled through the hidden veins of his own house, like a hunted man. The passage spat them out through a low door into the night, and the cold air struck Arthur like a slap. He had not been outdoors after dark in months. The stars wheeled overhead, hard and bright above the black shapes of the elms, and his own breath ghosted white before his face. Sarah led him across the wet grass, keeping to the shadow of the hedgerow until they came to a squat stone building at the very edge of the estate. The old carriage house, long abandoned, its timbers gray with rot and its windows dark. She hauled the door open just wide enough for them to slip through, then dragged it shut behind them. Inside, the darkness was thick and smelled of mold and old leather. Sarah crouched, and Arthur heard the strike of a flint. A small flame caught in a stub of candle she drew from her apron pocket, throwing a weak yellow light across the ruined space. A broken landau sat on its axles in the corner, its wheels gone. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like torn lace. Arthur leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. His legs felt strangely weak, and it angered him. "Now," he said, when he had breath enough, "you will tell me everything, and if a single word of it rings false, I will march you straight to the magistrate myself. Do you understand me?" Sarah set the candle on an upturned crate. In its light, she looked very young and very tired, but her eyes did not waver. "You believe I mean you harm," she said quietly. "I understand why. A maid locks you in your own study and drags you into the walls of your house. Any man would think me mad, or worse." She drew a slow breath. "But you did not drink from that cup, Your Grace, and you are still standing. That should tell you something." "It tells me nothing. Speak plainly." "My father was an apothecary," she said, "in Bath, before he died. I grew up among his jars and his powders and his ledgers of remedies. I know the smell of near every herb that grows in England, and I know the look of a great many that do not." She folded her hands to keep them from shaking. "I have served in your house 8 months, and for the past week, when I collected your glassware each morning, I have seen something on the rim of your cups that no cook or footman would ever notice." Arthur said nothing. The candle flame guttered. A fine dust, she went on, pale, like crushed sugar, but with a faint blue cast to it when the morning light struck it. Tasteless, odorless. It clings to the inside of a glass and dissolves the moment water is poured over it. She looked up at him. It is called aconitum dulcis, the sweet monkshood. My father showed it to me once, in a locked drawer, and warned me never to speak of it. It is not sold in any shop. It cannot be. There are perhaps a handful of men in the whole of the kingdom who could procure it. And what does this dust do? Arthur's voice had gone very low. It finishes slowly, Sarah said, a little each day. It weakens the heart, thins the blood, wearies the body from within. Given in small measures over 7 days, a strong man will simply grow tired, then breathless. Then his heart will stumble and stop in the night, and every physician in the land will swear he died of a natural failing. She held his gaze. No wound, no mark, no poison the coroner could ever name. They would bury you and never know. Arthur stared at her. Somewhere in the dark of his mind, small things he had ignored for days began to knit themselves together into a terrible whole. The fatigue that had settled over him like a wet cloak, the dryness in his throat that no water could ease, the way his heart had fluttered as he climbed the stairs 3 nights past, so that he had stopped and pressed a hand to his chest and told himself it was nothing, the tremor in his fingers this very evening as he tried to hold his pen. He looked down at his own right hand. In the candlelight, he watched it shake. 4 days, he said, and the words came out hoarse. It began 4 days ago. The tiredness. I thought, he stopped. I thought I had been working too hard. I thought I was growing old before my time. Sarah's face softened, and for the first time something like pity crept into it. Then, it has already begun, she said gently. You are not imagining it, Your Grace. Your body is already half poisoned. 4 doses, if I have counted the mornings right. The toxin is in your blood now, settling deeper each day. A cold silence fell between them. Arthur pushed himself off the wall and took an unsteady step toward her. And the cup tonight? He asked. The one in the study? The 5th dose. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. But it was different, heavier. I saw it when I filled the pitcher, twice the dust of any morning, perhaps 3 times. Not spread across a week. She swallowed. Someone grew impatient, Your Grace. Someone decided you had lingered long enough. That cup was not meant to weary you. It was meant to finish you. Tonight. The full weight of it landed on Arthur then, and he had to reach out and grip the edge of the broken landau to keep his feet. He had been dying for 4 days, and had not known it, had felt the poison in his own veins, and called it weariness. Had sat at his desk this very evening, exhausted and thirsty, and lifted the killing cup to his own lips, and if this quiet girl had not walked through his door in that single minute, he would even now be lying cold on his study floor, while the household slept, and the smooth, familiar voice would be arranging his funeral by morning. Who, he said, his knuckles had gone white on the rotten wood, who does a thing like this? Who walks past me every day, smiles at me, breaks bread at my table, and pours slow death into my cup for a week? Sarah did not answer at once. She reached into her apron and drew out a small, worn leather book, its cover cracked with age, her father's, he would later learn. She held it against her chest, like something precious. Someone who could reach the poison, she said at last. Someone who could reach your cups. Someone the servants would never question, and you would never suspect. Her eyes met his, dark and grave in the failing candlelight. The list of such men is very short, Your Grace, and every name upon it is a man you call your own. Outside, far across the fields, a dog began to bark, then another. Lights were moving at the manor. The hunt had begun. They traveled through the small hours on foot, keeping off the main road, and came at last to a coaching inn some 5 miles north as the sky turned gray with dawn. Sarah had thought of everything. Before they left the carriage house, she had pressed a bundle into Arthur's arms: a rough laborer's coat, a worn felt hat, a length of coarse scarf. "You cannot walk the road as a duke," she had said. "A gentleman traveling on foot at dawn draws the eye. A farmer and his sister do not." He had bristled at wearing another man's cast-offs, but he had worn them, and pulled the hat low and let the mud of the lane splash up his fine boots, until they looked like any travelers. The innkeeper, a stout woman with flour on her apron, gave them a small room above the tap room, and asked no questions once Sarah laid coin on the counter. Arthur watched her count it out. Where a maid had come by such coin he did not know, and he found he did not wish to ask. The room was mean and low, with a single window and a bed with a straw mattress. Sarah bolted the door. Arthur sat heavily on the room's one chair, and, in the thin morning light, looked at his companion properly for the first time. And the suspicion he had held at bay all night came rushing back. "Sit," he said. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "I have thought a great deal as we walked," Arthur said slowly. "About monkshood, that no shop will sell. About a poison so rare that only a handful of men in the kingdom could find it. And I keep returning to one small trouble." He leaned forward. "You knew it on sight, Sarah. The dust on my cup. You knew its name, its color, its every cruelty. You knew the exact number of days it takes to finish a man." His voice hardened. "How do I know it was not you who put it there? How do I know this is not some game? Poison the master, then play the savior, and bind him to you with gratitude. A maid raised so high she need never scrub a floor again?" He expected her to weep, to protest, to fall to her knees. She did none of these things. She looked at him steadily, and something in her jaw tightened, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet and cold. "If I wished you dead, Your Grace, I need only have stayed in my bed tonight," she said. "You would have drunk that cup within the hour. I have never in my life had to do less to finish a man than nothing at all." She let that sit between them. "I did not stay in my bed. I locked myself in a room with the most powerful man in the county and gave him a command, knowing he might have me hanged for it. That is a strange way to end someone." Arthur said nothing. She reached into her apron and drew out the worn leather book again. This time she did not clutch it to her chest. She crossed the room and set it open on the small table before him. "My father's remedy book," she said. "Read it yourself." Arthur bent over the yellowed pages. The hand was cramped and old, the ink faded to brown, but it was legible. Recipes, cures, notes on fevers and agues and the setting of broken bones. And there, near the middle, a page headed in careful letters, of the sweet monkshood and its undoing. He read. His father, Sarah's father, had written of the poison with a physician's dread, and beneath it, in the same hand, he had set down the only known remedy. A list of ingredients, chief among them, underlined twice, 3 words that meant nothing to Arthur. The lunar orchid. "My father spent his life healing people," Sarah said softly, watching his face. "He wrote this so that if ever he met a man dying of monkshood, he might have a chance to save him. He never did. He died before the chance came." She touched the edge of the page. "I have carried this book 8 months. Every morning I saw that dust, and I was afraid. And every morning I told myself I was imagining it, because to believe it was true meant believing something far worse." Arthur looked up. "And what is that?" She held his eyes. "That someone in your house had opened that locked drawer of the kingdom's rarest poison and got it out. Because monkshood such as this is not bought from a peddler, Your Grace. It is not grown in a garden. It comes from places that answer only to great men. and it is paid for with great sums." She drew a breath. "The kind of sums that must be drawn from a strong room, a vault, a treasury guarded so close that only 2 or 3 living souls hold the key." The room went very still. Arthur sat back in the chair. In his mind he saw the great iron door beneath the manor, in the deep cellars, where the wealth of Silvercrest had been kept for 200 years. He saw the men who could open it. He could count them on the fingers of one hand, and each face that rose before him was a face he had trusted since boyhood. His steward, his man of affairs, the cousin who managed his lands. Men he called family in all but blood. "It cannot be," he said, but the words had no strength in them. "It can," Sarah said gently. "It is. The poison came from your own vault, bought with your own gold, by a hand you shook this very week. Whoever wishes you dead does not lurk at your gate, your grace. He sits at your table, he wishes you good morning, he asks after your health with a kind face, and then he goes below and pays for the powder that stops your heart." Arthur pressed his hands over his face. When he lowered them, he looked 10 years older. "Then I am truly alone," he said hollowly. "There is no man in that house I can trust." "There is one thing you can do," Sarah said. "You must vanish, wholly and completely. Let them believe you fled in fear, or wandered off in a fever, or lie already dead in a ditch somewhere. So long as the poisoner thinks his work is nearly done, he will grow careless. He will stop watching the roads, and that is the only time we shall have to find the orchid and brew the cure, before the toxin already in your blood finishes what the cup began." Arthur was quiet a long moment. Then he stood, and though he swayed on his feet, he drew himself up with the old ducal iron. "Then the Duke of Silvercrest is dead," he said grimly, "until further notice. Where do we begin?" Sarah closed her father's book. "With a man who owes my father a debt," she said. "In the trading town. If anyone can help us brew what is written on that page, it is him. We ride at once." They came into the trading town by mid-afternoon, and the noise of it swallowed them whole. After the silence of the fields, the place was a shock to the senses. Carts rattled over the cobbles, their wheels striking sparks. Costermongers bawled the price of fish and winter apples. A knot of drovers pushed a flock of bleating sheep through the crush. And everywhere there were people, jostling, haggling, hurrying. So many that no one spared a second glance for a tired farmer and his sister, making their way toward the apothecary district. Sarah kept close to Arthur's side, one hand steadying his elbow. She had noticed, though she said nothing, that his steps had begun to falter over the last mile. Twice on the road he had stopped without a word and stood breathing hard, one hand braced against a milestone, until the grayness passed from his face. Now, as they turned into a narrow lane lined with shops, Arthur stopped again. He lifted his right hand and stared at it. The tremor had worsened. It was no longer a faint shiver he could hide beneath a glove. His fingers jumped and twitched of their own accord, as though they belonged to some palsied old man, and when he tried to still them by clenching his fist, the shaking traveled up his wrist instead. "It is spreading," Sarah said quietly. She took his trembling hand in both of hers and pressed it, feeling the erratic flutter beneath his skin. Her face grew grave. "The toxin is settling into the nerves now. This is the 4th stage. After this comes the breathlessness in earnest, and then—" She stopped herself. "We have less time than I hoped. Come, the shop is close." They pressed on down the lane. Arthur read the painted signboards as they passed. A mortar and pestle here, a coiled serpent there, the trademarks of the town's apothecaries and physicians. Sarah led him to the very end, to a low shop front squeezed between a chandler's and a rope-maker's, its window crowded with dusty blue bottles. Or it should have been. Sarah stopped so abruptly that Arthur nearly walked into her. The window was empty. The bottles were gone. Through the dusty glass, Arthur could see the inside of the shop laid bare, the shelves stripped, the counter cleared, the drawers hanging open and hollow, a padlock and chain hung on the door, and a scrap of paper pasted to it fluttered in the wind. Closed. Premises to let. No, Sarah breathed. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, staring in at the ruin of the place. No, this is wrong. Mr. Ferris has kept this shop for 30 years. He could not simply. She turned to Arthur, and for the first time the steadiness in her had cracked. He was my father's dearest friend. He is the one man in England who has brewed the monkshood cure before. He knows the old ways. Without him. Steady, Arthur said. It came out gentler than he meant it. Some part of him, even weakened as he was, could not bear to see her frightened. Someone must know where he has gone. Ask. Sarah collected herself. She caught the sleeve of a passing lad and pressed a coin into his palm, and the boy, wide-eyed, told them to ask the old flower seller on the corner. She saw everything on this lane, he said, and had a tongue to match. The flower seller was a bent old woman with a basket of drooping violets and a face like a walnut. When Sarah asked after Mr. Ferris the apothecary, the woman's eyes sharpened with the eagerness of one who has been waiting all day for someone to talk to. Gone, she said, cleared out, not 2 days since. And in such a hurry, dearie, you never saw the like. A carter came at dawn, and they loaded the whole shop into his wagon. Every bottle, every jar, every last stick of it. And off went old Ferris with them, white as a sheet, and not a word to no one. She leaned closer, dropping her voice. But I'll tell you what I think. I think it weren't his idea to go. Sarah went very still. Why do you say so? On account of the gentleman. The old woman tapped the side of her nose. The day before Ferris ran, a fine gentleman come to his shop. Grand coat, silver buttons, boots polished so you could see your face in 'em, spoke soft, but there was iron under it, if you take my meaning. He were in there the best part of an hour. She sniffed, and when he come out, he had Ferris's whole stock of the moonflower carried out to his own carriage. Every last bloom. Paid a fortune for it, they say, and told Ferris to sell no more to no one. Arthur felt the cold spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the poison. The moonflower, he said. You are certain of the words? That's what the flower trade calls it, sir. The moonflower. Lunar orchid, the learned folk say. Rare as hen's teeth and dear as gold. Ferris kept a little, always did, on account of it being good for the heart. The old woman shrugged. But it's all gone now, bought up. And the man that bought it didn't look to me like a man who meant to cure anybody. This gentleman, Sarah pressed. What did he look like? The old woman screwed up her face in thought. Tall, well-fed, a trim beard going gray at the edges, middling years, carried himself like a man used to being obeyed. Not a lord, mind, but the sort who stands close to one. She shrugged again. And a signet ring on his hand, gold, with some sort of bird cut into it. A hawk, might have been. Sarah felt Arthur go rigid beside her. She turned. His face had drained of what little color it held. His trembling hand had risen, unbidden, to cover his mouth. A hawk, he said, so low she barely caught it. Rising, with its wings spread. You know it, Sarah whispered. It is the crest of my own house, Arthur said. The Silvercrest hawk. Only those closest to me are permitted to wear it upon a ring. His voice was hollow. My steward wears one. My man of affairs, my cousin. I gave those rings myself, with my own hand, as a mark of my trust. He lowered his hand and looked at her, and in his eyes was the particular horror of a man who has just watched a door close on his last hope of being wrong. He is a full day ahead of us, Arthur said. and he has bought up every flower we need to save my life. He is not merely trying to finish me, Sarah. He is unmaking the cure itself, bloom by bloom, so that even if I should learn the truth, I could never undo it." The old flower seller looked between them, sensing something amiss. "You in some trouble, dearie?" Sarah did not answer. She was staring past the woman, past the shuttered shop, her mind racing back through the pages of her father's book, through everything he had ever taught her about where the moonflower grew, and how, and in what wild and hidden place it might still be found by two desperate souls with nothing left to lose. "There is one hope," she said at last, "but we shall have to climb for it." They found a horse dealer at the edge of town, willing to part with 2 rough hill ponies for more coin than they were worth. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, they were high on the northern road, climbing. Sarah had chosen the beasts well. They were shaggy, sure-footed little things, bred for the moors, and they picked their way up the stony track without complaint, while a finer horse would have shied and stumbled. Arthur rode a length behind her, hunched in his borrowed coat against the wind, and Sarah kept glancing back to be sure he was still in the saddle. He was worse this morning. She had seen it the moment he woke in the hayloft where they had sheltered. The gray cast to his skin, the shadows beneath his eyes, the way he had to stop and gather himself before every breath, as though air had become a thing he must fetch from a great distance. When he spoke, his words came in short bursts between breaths. "How far?" he asked now. The 2 words cost him. "The northern ridge lies a day's hard riding ahead," Sarah said. "The lunar orchid does not grow in gardens or greenhouses, whatever the townfolk buy and sell. It grows wild, in one place only that my father ever knew of, the deep caves of the high ridge, where water drips down the stone and the cold keeps the air still." She looked back at him. "It is a bitter climb, Your Grace. I will not pretend otherwise, but the flowers Ferris kept were cut from that very place, years ago. Whatever your steward has bought and burned, he cannot buy the mountain. The wild orchids will still be there." Arthur nodded, saving his breath. They rode on. The country grew wilder around them, the hedgerows giving way to open moor, the moor to bare rock and heather. The wind came down off the heights with a keen edge, and Arthur pulled his scarf higher. Once he swayed so badly that Sarah reined in and reached across to steady him, gripping his arm until the fit passed. He did not thank her, but he did not pull away either, and she counted that as something. It was near midday, as they came over a bare shoulder of the hill, that Sarah saw it. She stopped her pony dead and threw out a hand. "Down," she hissed. "Off the skyline." Arthur followed her pointing hand. Below them, on the winding cart track that snaked up the far side of the valley toward the same high ridge, a carriage was moving. It was no farmer's wagon. Even at this distance, Sarah could make out the gleam of its black lacquer, the matched pair of horses, the driver perched high on the box. A private carriage, fine and fast, driving hard for the summit, and painted on its door, small but unmistakable, in a stray shaft of sunlight, was a device she had come to dread. A hawk, rising, with its wings spread. Arthur saw it too. She heard the breath catch in his ruined chest. "They are ahead of us," he said hoarsely. "Even now, even here." "They know," Sarah said grimly. "They must have guessed you would think of the wild orchids, just as I did. Or Ferris told them, poor soul, with a knife at his throat." She watched the carriage climb, her jaw tight. "They are not carrying flowers up that mountain, Your Grace. They are going up to destroy the ones that grow there, to salt the ground, to burn the caves, so that when the last of the town's supply is gone, there will be nothing left in all of England to save you." Arthur was silent. His trembling hand had knotted in his pony's mane. "Then we must reach the caves first," he said. "We must. Their road is smoother than ours," And their horses are fresh, Sarah said. She turned in her saddle, studying the land with the eye of a girl who had grown up walking hills. But their carriage cannot leave the cart track. It must go the long way round the valley's head, where the road can carry wheels. We are on ponies. We can go straight up. She pointed to a faint sheep path that climbed the near slope almost vertically, a thread of trodden earth through the heather. It is steeper. It is harder, but it is shorter by half. If your strength holds, we may yet come to the ridge before them. Arthur looked up the terrible slope. Then he looked at her. My strength, he said, with the ghost of grim humor, is a poor thing to wager a life on just now, but it is the only wager left to me. He gathered his reins in his shaking hands. Lead on, and do not slow for me. If I fall behind, ride ahead and cut the flowers. Better one of us reaches them than neither. I will not leave you on a hillside to die alone, Sarah said, and there was a fierceness in it that surprised them both. Arthur looked at her strangely. In 12 years no servant had spoken to him so, not with defiance, but with a plain, stubborn care, as though his life were a thing worth fighting for, beyond the duty owed a master. He found he had no answer to it, and so he only nodded, and nudged his pony toward the path. They climbed. It was worse than Sarah had feared. The path was cruel, near vertical in places, the footing loose scree that slid away beneath the pony's hooves. The wind rose to a shriek. Arthur's breath came in ragged gasps now, each one a labor, and twice he lurched so far in the saddle that only his grip on the mane saved him. Sarah pressed on just ahead, calling encouragement over her shoulder, choosing the surest footing, her own hands raw with cold on the reins. Across the valley, the black carriage climbed too, smaller now, following the long curve of the road toward the head of the pass. Now and then Sarah stole a glance at it, judging the race. They were gaining. The straight, brutal climb was buying them minutes the smooth road could not. But the light was already beginning to fail. Cloud was piling up black and heavy against the western peaks, and the wind carried on it the first cold spit of rain. A storm was coming down off the high ground, and it was coming fast. Sarah, Arthur's voice was a thread. She turned to see him slumped over his pony's neck, his face gray as ash, his eyes half closed. I cannot feel my hands, and the breath will not. He swayed. She was off her pony and at his side in an instant, hauling him upright by the collar of his coat, holding him in the saddle by main force. Look at me, she commanded. Look at me, Arthur. The name slipped out. She did not care. The caves are there. Do you see? Just below that black crag, where the rock splits, 1/2 mile, no more. She gripped his face in her frozen hand and made him look. 1/2 mile of breath. That is all I ask of you. Can you give me 1/2 mile? Arthur's eyes found the crag. Then they found her face, and something in it steadied him. 1/2 mile, he whispered, and as the first true lash of the storm broke over the ridge, they drove their ponies up the last cruel slope toward the darkness in the rock, with the black carriage cresting the head of the pass behind them, its lamps flaring to life against the coming night. The mouth of the cave swallowed them out of the storm. One moment the wind was tearing at their coats, and the rain drove sideways like flung gravel. The next, they had ducked beneath the black lip of stone, and the roar fell away behind them to a muffled howl. Sarah slid from her pony and pulled Arthur down after her, half catching him as his legs gave. She looped the reins around a jut of rock and drew him deeper into the dark, out of the wind's reach. "A moment," she said. "Rest a moment. Then we go on." Arthur sank against the cold wall, his chest heaving. In the gray half-light that reached in from the storm, he looked like a dead man already, lips gone bluish, eyes sunk deep, every breath a wet and desperate thing. Sarah knelt and pressed 2 fingers to the pulse at his throat, and what she felt there made her hands tighten. It was fast and thin and stumbling, skipping beats like a stone across water. She said nothing of it. "Can you walk?" "Lead," he breathed. "I follow." She lit the stub of candle she had guarded all this way, cupping the flame against the draught, and led him into the belly of the earth. The cave narrowed and turned and dropped. Water dripped from unseen heights and ran in thin ribbons down the walls, and the air grew colder and stiller with every step, until their breath hung about them, and the only sound was the steady plink of falling drops. Sarah went slowly, one hand trailing the wet rock, reading the walls the way another might read a page. Her father had described this place to her 100 times by the fire, though he had visited it but once in his youth. "Follow the water down. Where the water pools, the moonflower grows, for it loves the wet and the dark and the cold that never lifts." They went down a long time. Arthur's footsteps behind her grew heavier and more uneven, and twice she stopped to let him lean against her and gather his breath. She did not hurry him, she could not, but in her mind she counted the beats of his failing pulse, and she knew they were racing something now that had nothing to do with any carriage. Then the passage opened. They came out into a low chamber where a still black pool lay across the floor, fed by the ceaseless drip from above. And there, in a deep crevice at the pool's far edge, where the candlelight barely reached, Sarah saw a faint answering glow. She caught her breath. They were small and pale and grew in a tight cluster from the wet rock, flowers no larger than a thumbnail, their petals a soft, ghostly white that seemed to hold a light of their own, glowing faintly in the dark like fallen stars. The lunar orchid. She had thought she might never see one living, yet here they were, exactly where her father had promised, having grown in this cold and secret dark, long before either of them was born. "There," she whispered, "there it is, the whole of your life, Arthur, growing in a crack in the rock." She set the candle on a ledge and waded to the crevice. The water was ankle-deep and cold enough to steal the breath, but she barely felt it. Kneeling, she drew her father's small knife from her apron and began, with the greatest care, to cut. It was not the flowers she needed, but the roots, the pale threads that clung to the stone beneath. For her father's book was plain that the cure lay in the root and not the bloom. She worked slowly, gently, easing each one free without breaking it, her cold fingers steady with the discipline of long training. She had freed 3 good roots and was reaching for a 4th when the light changed. A glow, warmer and larger than her own guttering candle, spilled into the chamber from the passage behind them, and with it came a sound that turned her blood to water, the tread of boots on wet stone. More than one man. 3, perhaps. Sarah froze, knife in hand, waist-deep in shadow. Across the chamber, Arthur pressed himself back against the wall. A figure filled the mouth of the passage, holding a burning torch high. Behind him came 2 more, broad and rough, the kind of men who are hired for their fists and ask no questions. The torchlight threw their shadows huge and wavering across the dripping walls. The man in front stepped forward into the chamber, and the torch lit his face. Sarah did not know it, but she felt Arthur go rigid beside her, felt the shock go through him like a blow, and she understood before he spoke a word. He was a man of middling years, well-fed, with a trim beard going gray at the edges, and a coat of fine cloth, ill-suited to a cave. Upon his hand, where it gripped the torch, gleamed a gold signet ring, and cut into it, catching the flame, was a hawk with its wings spread. The man's eyes swept the chamber and found the Duke slumped against the wall, and his face, which had been set and grim, went slack with pure astonishment. "You," he said. He came a step closer, staring, as though he could not credit what the torch showed him. "You are alive. You are standing on your own feet." His gaze flicked to the pool, to the glowing flowers, to Sarah frozen among them with the knife and the cut roots in her hands, and understanding crawled across his features. "The maid," he breathed, "the little apothecary's girl. So it was you. You pulled him out of that study before the cup was drained, and you have dragged the dying fool halfway across the county after a flower." He gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "I had wondered. When the household woke, and he was simply gone, I told them he had wandered off in a fever to die in a ditch. I very nearly believed it myself." Arthur pushed himself upright off the wall. It cost him everything. His legs shook and his breath sawed in his throat. But he stood, and he lifted his gray face to the man with the ring, and he spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, yet carried across the still, cold air. "Not you," he said. "Of all of them, I would not have believed it was you." The man's smile faded. For a moment, something moved behind his eyes that might have been shame, or might only have been calculation. "No," he agreed quietly, "you would not. That was rather the point." He raised the torch and glanced at the two brutes behind him, and his voice hardened into command. "The flowers first. Burn what she has cut, and tear the rest from the rock. Then the girl." He looked at Arthur, and something like regret crossed his face. "He will be dead by morning regardless. There is no need for us to trouble him further. The poison will do its work. It always does." The two men stepped forward into the water, and Sarah, standing waist-deep in the freezing pool, with 3 precious roots clutched to her chest, and death closing in from the only door, made herself very still, and began, very quietly, to think. "Stop!" Sarah's voice rang off the wet stone, sharp and clear, and the 2 hired men halted mid-stride in the pool. She had not moved. She stood exactly as before, the water black around her waist, the cut roots held in the crook of one arm. But in her other hand, raised now into the torchlight where all could see it, she held a small glass vial, stoppered with wax. The liquid within it was a sickly yellow, and it caught the flame with an oily gleam. The steward's eyes went to it at once. "And what is that meant to be?" "You know who my father was," Sarah said. Her voice was steady, almost conversational, and that steadiness was more frightening than any scream. "You bought his life stock from Ferris. You have hunted his daughter across half the county for a flower. So you know what an apothecary keeps in the locked drawer that even the shopkeeper never sees." She turned the vial slowly, so the yellow liquid rolled. "This is oil of vitriol, drawn thin, and mixed with something my father made that I will not name aloud. In the open air it is nothing, a bad smell, but in a place like this—" She lifted her chin at the low roof, the still black pool, the dead, unmoving air. "Where no wind stirs and the air lies heavy and does not move, the vapor sinks. It pools along the floor like water, and it steals the breath from a man's lungs without his ever knowing he has breathed it, until his legs give and he does not rise again." The chamber went very still. Even the dripping seemed to pause. "You are lying," the steward said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Perhaps." Sarah's thumb moved to the wax stopper. "The glass is thin, and my hand is very cold, and I have been holding it a long while now. If I let it fall against these rocks, we shall all of us learn together whether I am lying. You and your men are gathered at the low mouth of this chamber, where the air is heaviest." She tilted her head. "I stand upon the rise, by the pool. The vapor will reach you first. It will reach you long before it reaches me." One of the hired brutes took a step backward toward the passage. The steward's arm shot out to stop him. "Hold!" he snapped. But his eyes had begun to move, to the low roof, to the dead air, to the girl on the rise and himself in the hollow, and Sarah saw the arithmetic working behind them. He was not a brave man, he was a careful one. A man who poisoned from a distance, over 7 slow days, precisely because he had no stomach for the closeness of finishing. Such a man does not gamble his own breath on a maid's bluff. "You would die too," he said. "I am a poor servant girl, with nothing," Sarah answered. "You are a wealthy man, with a hawk on your ring, and a great deal to lose. I think you value your life a good deal more than I value mine, and I think you know it." The steward stood frozen, torch aloft, caught between his greed and his fear. His men waited on his word, and his word would not come. And in that suspended breath, that single instant where every eye in the cave was fixed upon the little vial of yellow poison, Arthur moved. He had gathered his strength in silence while Sarah spoke, drawing on some final reserve he had not known he possessed. Now he pushed off the wall and lunged, not at the men, but at the one thing that ruled the chamber. His shaking hand closed on the steward's wrist, the hand that held the torch, and with the whole failing weight of his body, he wrenched it downward, into the black water of the pool. The torch hissed, the flame drowned, and the cave fell into absolute, perfect darkness. A shout went up. In the pitch black, the two hired men blundered and cursed, colliding with one another, their voices booming and doubling off the unseen walls until they could not tell one direction from another. The steward roared for a light, for his men, for anyone. His careful composure shattered all at once. But Sarah had already dropped the vial into her apron, for there had never been any vapor in it at all. It was a tincture of iron and sulfur her father had used for staining wood, no more deadly than vinegar, and she was moving. She had lived 1,000 nights in the dark of her father's cellars, and she had marked the way in and the way out with the patience of the trained. She found Arthur by touch, seizing the sleeve she knew, pressing her mouth to where his ear must be. "With me," she breathed. "Do not speak. Trust your feet to me." She took his hand and led him along the wall, away from the flailing chaos of the men, back toward the passage they had come by. She counted her steps as she had counted them coming in. Here the wall turned, here the roof dropped, and they must stoop. Here the floor rose out of the water and grew dry. Behind them the shouting swelled and then thinned to confusion as the steward and his brutes groped after phantoms, striking sparks with flint that would not catch in the wet, cursing a darkness that had no mercy in it. Arthur stumbled after her, blind and gasping, his strength all but spent. But she did not let go of his hand, and she did not slow, and step by counted step, she drew him up out of the deep and toward the faint gray stain of stormlight that marked the cave's mouth. They came out into the teeth of the gale. The storm had not slackened. If anything, it had grown, the rain sheeting down and the wind howling across the black ridge, and Sarah nearly wept with relief at the fury of it. For in that noise and that darkness, no man could track two fleeing souls across the open mountain. She untied one pony with fumbling hands, boosted Arthur onto its back, and swung up behind him, wrapping one arm hard about his chest to hold him in the saddle. "Hold to the mane," she shouted over the wind. "I have you." She drove the pony down the sheep path, away from the cave, away from the trapped men blundering in the dark behind them. Somewhere far below in the streaming night, the black carriage still stood waiting at the head of the pass, its driver hunched against the rain, his master shouting himself hoarse in a cave he could not find his way out of. And in the crook of Sarah's arm, pressed between her body and the pony's neck to shield it from the rain, 3 pale roots of the lunar orchid glowed faintly against the dark. The whole of a duke's life, carried down a storm-lashed mountain by a maid who had bluffed 3 armed men with a bottle of wood-stain and won. But Arthur was fading. She could feel it in the slackness of his body, in the shallow catch of each breath against her arm. The cure was in her keeping now. She had only to reach shelter, and brew it, and pour it down his throat, before his stumbling heart gave out for good. She bent low over him against the storm and rode. The shepherd's hut appeared out of the storm like a thing dreamed, a low black shape of piled stone huddled against the mountainside, half its roof fallen in, its door long gone. But 3 walls stood, and a corner of it was dry, and that was all Sarah asked of the world just then. She got Arthur down from the pony more by will than strength, taking his whole weight as he slid from the saddle, and half carried him through the empty doorway into the shelter of the stone. She laid him in the dry corner against the wall, out of the reach of the rain that hissed through the broken roof, and for a moment she only knelt beside him with her hand at his throat, feeling for the pulse. It was there, barely, fast and thready and skipping, like a moth beating itself to death against a lamp. His skin had gone cold and clammy under her fingers, his lips gray, his breath so shallow she had to lean close to be sure it came at all. Hours. He had hours left, and perhaps not many of them Sarah moved. There was no time for despair, and she did not permit herself any. She gathered what dry sticks and old fern she could find in the fallen corners of the hut, built them small and tight in the lee of the wall, and struck her flint again and again with numb fingers, until at last a spark took and a thin flame licked up. She fed it carefully, coaxing it, sheltering it with her body from the draught, until it burned steady and threw a small trembling light across the ruined stone. From her apron she drew her father's book, and the little iron pot she had carried all this way, and the 3 pale roots of the lunar orchid. She opened the book to the page she had read 100 times and knew by heart, and read it once more anyway, because a mistake here would not weary the Duke, it would finish him. Of the sweet monkshood and its undoing, her father's cramped brown hand, the list of what must be added, and in what measure, and above all the warning he had underlined twice and written out in full beneath. The heat must be gentle and constant. Bring it too high, and the root turns from cure to poison, as cruel as the ill it was meant to mend. Watch the pot, and do not look away. She would not look away. She filled the pot with clean rainwater, caught in a broken slate. She washed the roots in it, then set them to steep, and settled the pot at the very edge of the little fire, not in the flames, never in the flames, but at that precise margin where the water would tremble but never truly boil. And there she crouched, and there she stayed, one hand upon the pot to feel its heat, feeding the fire a twig at a time to hold it even, adding a drop of water when it grew too fierce, drawing it back when it climbed too high. The rain drummed on what remained of the roof. The wind moaned through the gaps in the stone, and Arthur, from his corner, watched her work through half-closed eyes. "You have been awake," he said. His voice was a thread, spun out between shallow breaths. 4 days, and you have not once. "Do not talk," Sarah said, without looking up from the pot. "You have little breath, spend none of it on me." But he went on, "Because a dying man says the things he means to say. 4 days ago," he breathed, "I did not know your name. You were a gray shape at the edge of a room. I never once looked at you. A pause, a struggle for air, and you have carried me up a mountain. You have bluffed armed men with a bottle of nothing. You are sitting through a storm on a cold floor, watching a pot, so that a master who never saw you might live." His gray face turned toward her in the firelight. "Why? What am I to you, that you would do all this?" Sarah's hand did not leave the pot, but something moved across her face. "My father was a good man," she said quietly. "He healed whoever came to his door, the rich, the poor, the ones who could pay, and the ones who could not. He used to say that a life is a life, and it is not for us to weigh whose is worth the saving." She adjusted a twig on the fire. "He died with a cure written in this book that he never once got to use. I have carried it 8 months. watching a man be finished by inches, telling myself I was mad to think it. Her voice grew rough. When I finally let myself believe it, I could not stand by, not, and still call myself his daughter. She looked up at last, and met his eyes across the small fire. You are not owed my care, because you are a duke, your grace. You would have it, if you were a beggar in a ditch. That is the whole of it. Arthur had no answer. In all his life, no one had cared for him for less than what he could give them. And here was a girl who would have carried a beggar up the same mountain. He closed his eyes, and something eased in him that had nothing to do with the poison. The night wore on. The brew darkened. Sarah watched the pot as though her own life depended on it, and in every way that mattered it did, for she knew what she would do if the man in the corner died despite her. She would not forgive herself for it as long as she lived. At last, as the first faint gray of dawn crept into the eastern gaps of the stone, the liquid in the pot turned the deep, clear amber her father's book had promised. Sarah lifted it from the fire and set it in the rain to cool, and when she could bear to hold the iron, she strained the bitter serum into a cup and knelt at Arthur's side. His breath had grown terrible now. Long pauses between each pull of air, so that twice she thought it had stopped for good, and her heart stopped with it. Arthur! She lifted his head into her lap and pressed the cup to his lips. Drink, all of it. It is bitter, and it will burn, but you must drink every drop. She tilted it. I did not carry you this far to lose you at the end of it. Drink. His eyes opened, unfocused, and found her face, and with the last of his strength he drank, the whole bitter draught, swallow by laboring swallow, while she held the cup steady, and held his head steady, and held, silently, to a hope she hardly dared to name. The cup emptied. His head fell back against her arm, and Sarah knelt in the grey light of the ruined hut, cradling the dying Duke of Silvercrest, and waited to learn whether 4 days of running had been enough, or whether she had brewed the finest cure her father ever wrote, 1 hour too late. 2 days later, the grand hall of Silvercrest Manor was full of black. Word had spread that the Duke was dead. The household had woken 5 mornings past to find their master vanished, and when he did not return, the steward had let it be understood, with a heavy, sorrowing face, that his grace had been struck down by a sudden failing of the heart while walking the grounds at dusk, and had been found too late. A funeral was being arranged. The manor draped its mirrors and hushed its halls, and now the county had come to mourn. They filled the grand hall in their mourning dress. The neighboring gentry, the tenants, the household staff gathered along the walls, all of them speaking in the low murmur of the bereaved. At the front of the hall, near the great empty chair where the Duke had sat in judgment for 12 years, stood the steward. He wore black, like the rest, and grief like the rest, and he did it very well. His face was drawn and solemn. His voice, when he addressed the assembly, was thick with a sorrow that fooled every soul in the room. He spoke of his master's kindness, of the years of loyal service between them, of the cruel suddenness of his passing. A gold ring gleamed on his hand as he pressed it to his heart, and the hawk upon it caught the light. "We have lost a great man," he said, and let his voice break. "I served him near 20 years. I do not know how any of us shall." The great doors at the end of the hall swung open. The murmur died. Every head turned, and into the hall, out of the grey morning light, walked Duke Arthur of Silvercrest. He was not dead. He was not dying. He walked the length of his own hall on his own 2 feet, pale still, a little thinner than the county remembered, but upright and steady and sharp-eyed, dressed in his own fine dark coat with his head held high, and a single pace behind him, plainly dressed in grey, her hands folded and her chin level, walked the maid Sarah. The hall erupted. A gentlewoman cried out. Someone dropped a glass, and it shattered on the flagstones. Servants pressed back against the walls with their hands to their mouths, and the assembled gentry rose half out of their seats, staring as though a ghost walked among them. But it was the steward's face that Sarah watched, and she saw everything pass across it in an instant. The disbelief, the terror, the swift and frantic calculation of a trapped man. He had left the Duke dying in a cave. He had come down the mountain certain of it. And here his master walked, alive and whole, into the very hall where he had just wept false tears over the grave. Arthur came to a halt before the empty chair. He did not sit. He turned to face the room, and when he spoke, his voice filled the hall as it had always filled it, clear and cold and commanding. "I am not dead," he said, "though a great deal of care and a great deal of gold was spent to make me so." He let the silence stretch. Then he raised his hand, and in it he held two things. The first was a small, worn leather book. The second was a bundle of letters, tied with cord. "5 days ago," Arthur said, "I lifted a cup of water to my lips in my own study. Had I drunk from it, I would be lying now beneath a stone, and every physician in the county would have sworn on his honor that my heart had simply failed. No wound, no poison, any coroner could name." His eyes moved across the assembly. That is the particular cruelty of the sweet monkshood. It finishes a man slowly, over 7 days, and calls it a natural death. I was already 4 days into the dying, and did not know it. A gasp went round the hall. "I did not drink," Arthur went on, "because one person in all this house had the eyes to see the poison, and the courage to risk everything to stop me. This book," he lifted the worn leather volume, "belonged to an apothecary of Bath. It holds the only cure for that poison, written anywhere in England. His daughter carried it. His daughter cut the cure from a cave in a storm, with armed men at her back. His daughter brewed it in a shepherd's hut, and poured it down my throat with an hour to spare." He looked to Sarah, and the whole hall looked with him. "I owe her my life. Every soul in this room owes her the fact that their Duke stands before them breathing." Then his face hardened, and he turned toward the steward. "But a cure is only half of what I found on that mountain." He lifted the bundle of letters. "When the man who did this fled the cave, he left in such haste that he left his carriage behind him at the head of the pass. We searched it, and beneath the seat we found these: his correspondence, his accounts, the record of monkshood drawn from the treasury vault of this very house, bought with my own gold, by a man who wore my own crest upon his hand, as a mark of my trust." The steward had gone the color of ash. He took a step back. "Say his name, Your Grace," someone called from the crowd. "Who? Who among us?" Arthur looked at the man he had trusted for 20 years, the man who had taught him to ride as a boy, who had stood at his father's funeral, who had wept false tears over him not a minute since. "His name is Edmund Crail," Arthur said quietly. "My steward, the man I called the most loyal servant of this house." His voice did not rise, and that was worse than any shout. "Ambition, Edmund? Debt? I shall never trouble to understand it. A man who would by inches over 7 patient days has a sickness in him no reason can explain." Crail opened his mouth. No words came. There were letters in his own hand, not 10 feet from him, and no lie left in the world could cover them. 2 of the Duke's men stepped forward from the walls and took him quietly by the arms, and he did not struggle. He was led from the hall a broken man, stripped of his ring and his place, to be held under guard and put beyond the county's borders in exile, for the Duke would have no bloodshed done even to one who had earned it, and Sarah had asked, quietly, that there be none. When the doors had closed behind him, Arthur turned once more to the hall. "There is one thing more," he said, "and then you may all go home and unhang your mirrors, for there will be no funeral." A thin, tired humor touched his mouth. "For 12 years a girl served in this house, and I never once learned her name. I know it now. I shall not forget it again." He turned to Sarah, and before the whole assembled county, he inclined his head to her, a duke bowing to a maid. "Sarah," he said, "I ask you, before all these witnesses, to remain at Silvercrest, not as a servant, but as chief physician of this estate, and as my own counsel in all things. No cup will ever be poured in this house again that you have not judged safe, and no soul under my roof shall ever again go unseen." The hall was utterly silent. Then, somewhere at the back, a single pair of hands began to clap, and another joined, and another, until the sound filled the great stone room. Sarah stood in her plain gray dress amid the applause of the county that had, a quarter hour before, come to bury her master. She thought of her father, and his book, and his creed that a life is a life, and not for us to weigh. She thought he would have been well pleased. "I will stay," she said, and the Duke of Silvercrest, who had walked into his own funeral and out the other side, smiled at the maid who had saved him, and the whole court stood speechless at the apothecary's daughter who had mastered the poisoner's cure.